11 November 1918. Delegates from the major European countries that had been fighting the Great World War met in a train car in a quiet part of the forest about 60 miles north of Paris, France. It was the third day of their meetings. These meetings had been initiated by the Germans, who over the previous several months had recognized and come to terms with the fact that they could no longer continue fighting and sought a settlement to end the war. And so between 5 and 6 a.m. that morning, all parties signed the Armistice, ending combat operations in the European theater. Now it's important to note that although it was signed between 5 and 6 that morning, it didn't come into effect until 11 a.m. By some accounts, 11:11. So it was 11th minute of the 11th hour, the 11th month. And while this was not officially the end of World War I, it was the end of combat operations. This armistice would be continued 3 more times until the war was officially ended 8 months later in June with the Treaty of Versailles. Now, like I said, the armistice was signed at 5 that morning, between 5 and 6 a.m., and ended at 11. Now, both sides of the militaries recognized that the war was probably going to end at 11, so they continued fighting up until that final minute. And by some accounts, they actually increased their shelling in an effort to get rid of extra ordnance so they wouldn't have to bring it home or dispose of it, because that's difficult. So on the morning of November 11th, the last day of World War I, across both sides, 2,738 soldiers lost their lives, and over 10,000 casualties were sustained on the final day of combat. This is a tragic, but perhaps fitting end to World War I, which was the greatest, most costly, most devastating war that the world had ever seen. For almost 4 years, Germany, England, France, Russia, and others engaged in nearly continuous combat in multiple fronts and multiple theaters. Most notably on the Western Front, fighting bogged down to a stalemate, which manifested as basically a moonscape which extended from the English Channel all the way down to Switzerland. And both sides lobbed ordnance at each other for 4 years straight. And this ordnance was artillery, new weaponry such as artillery, machine guns, gas. Soldiers were sent into the fray. And over the course of these 4 years, the gains made by both sides were measured in meters, not miles. As an example of some of this fighting, now some of the battles are infamous now. You guys may know the names of the Battle of Ypres, the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Somme, particularly, which happened about halfway through the war, kicked off on 1 July 1916 with a British ground offensive. And on that one day, the British suffered 60,000 casualties, which, to put that in perspective, is more than the U.S. has suffered in the 17 years since 9/11, significantly more. So World War I was a major event. And my purpose today here is not to give a history of World War I, but more to explain why Armistice Day is important. Generations were lost in the 4 years prior to Armistice Day, 1918. Fast forward 100 years. Last month, 11 November 2018, was the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. And I intended to give this speech more in conjunction with that day. I actually signed up for it for, I think, 10 November, but I wasn't able to give it. But on that day, you guys may have seen that it was covered in the news. The world leaders met in Paris, France, and observed Armistice Day. In my opinion, it was a little bit overshadowed by some political squabbling that erupted out of it. But it was nonetheless a big day, specifically for our European partners. But how many Americans do you think truly understand, recognize, or appreciate the meaning of Armistice Day and World War I in general? I would argue probably not a lot. This is for several reasons. First of all, the United States had a less direct role, or a less involved role in World War I than it did in World War II. Secondly, the last combat veteran of World War I died in 2012. So we are one generation removed from World War I. There's still a significant number, although dwindling, of World War II veterans alive to tell their stories firsthand. We don't have that with World War I. However, I do think it's important that we continue to recognize and remember the sacrifices made in World War I, and especially the importance it had shaping today's world. Many historians recognize that World War I was a major watershed event in modern history. In some ways, a turning point of history. It shaped the entire 20th century. The results of World War I directly led to the outbreak of World War II, which led to the nuclear era and the Cold War, and then the subsequent modern age. So World War I is only 100 years ago. And when you think about it, it's not really that long. Many people live to be 100 years old. Like I said, we are only one generation removed. World War I, however, is receding in the collective memory, and I think it's important that we all remember it. So my point today here is to make you a little aware of a major milestone or major anniversary that was passed just a month ago, and hopefully inspire you to go back and look at it and recognize and understand what Armistice Day meant, what World War I meant to an entire generation. Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and especially Brad. It's pretty tough to top the last two evaluators, but I'll try. All right, so the purpose of Brad's speech was to focus on putting the emphasis on adding language to increase the interest and impact of the story that he was telling to us. For me as the evaluator, I was tasked to listen to the descriptive words that he used, the literary elements, the plot and the setting, and then it asked, was I engaged and did it keep my interest? And I would have to say emphatically, yes, it did. I thought you did an excellent job. Great speech. The things that I think you excelled at are setting the stage for the speech. You began with talking about how the Germans had been working for 3 days in preparations with these secret meetings leading up to Armistice Day. I thought you did a really good job of jumping around. So you talked about that, and then you talked about the Treaty of Versailles, and then you went back to the battles, and then you went forward to what led out of World War I with World War II, and then the Cold War. And I thought it was, it just held my attention the whole time, so I think it was a good job. As far as descriptive words and literary elements, I thought your choice of words was excellent. You talked about the moonscape between the English Channel and Switzerland. You had lists, which I thought were a great literary element to hold our attention. You talked about the weapons of war, the battles. You described the battles in detail, and you talked about all the casualties that resulted, and sometimes unnecessarily, like the 10,000 casualties the last day of the war. Then you came to the 100-year anniversary and brought it into the modern day and kind of an application for our lives right now. And then at the very end, you gave us a call to study history, and specifically World War I history, and learn from the mistakes of the past. Things that I think you could work on. I liked the repetition that you used. You said one generation removed twice, and I think you could have done a little more as far as repeating some of the important phrases, just to help us remember the things that you wanted us to remember. At the beginning, I thought you had really good gestures. You were kind of in front of the podium most of the time. And something that Kyle said to me last week after my speech, she recommended that I start the speech walking around like Patton. You know, at the beginning. And I thought that was, that would have been entertaining. And I think you could have done that a little bit better. I know the theme of it was very somber, but when you were talking about all the deaths, you could have exaggerated your emotions just to draw us in a little bit more. But overall, great work, and as always, as a member of the Navy, you most importantly, you should work on your probity. Great